Today we are pleased to bring you a topic that has brought much debate, death with dignity. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Norton, who has been working with the Connecticut State Legislature to pass legislation that would allow adults with terminal illness to have the right to end their lives peacefully in a dignified way, surrounded by family and loved ones. He will share his personal story, bring us a legislative update, and answer your questions. James is a Connecticut native, two-time Tony Award-winning actor, receiving his Tony Awards for City of Angels in Chicago. We all recognize him not only for his work in the theater, but also in movies and television. It is my pleasure. Please join me in welcoming actor, director, and activist James Norton.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Because otherwise I'll have to use my stage voice. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share with you my thoughts on this weighty but very welcome legislation, which in April just failed again for the umpteenth time since 1994, when it was first introduced in Connecticut. I'm certainly not a health professional or policy authority, but I am a citizen who has had the unfortunate experience of managing the protracted illness and loss of a beloved wife. Pam and I were raised in West Hartford. We met at 17, dated through college, she at Middlebury in Vermont, I at Brown in Providence. She endured 9- and 10-hour bus trips to come down to see me, and I hitchhiked through winter storms to see her. And let me tell you, that's not an easy hitch, as there is no direct route from Providence to Middlebury. We married after college, had a son and a daughter by the time we were 25, while I was in graduate school at the Yale Drama School. And for many decades, we lived a charmed life, until an ultrasound confirmed that there was a mass in her pancreas. I'll never forget getting that phone call. And thus, out of the blue, we began our trek through the medical complex. Surgery at Memorial Sloan Kettering, the Whipple procedure, one of the most complex according to the doctors. Months of chemotherapy administered at Norwalk Hospital. Innumerable infections necessitating the inevitable weekends in the hospital because the labs don't work on weekends in the hospitals, and so one has to wait until Monday morning for someone to drop some different drugs into the petri dish to determine which antibiotic to throw at the infection. At one point, we spent 3 weekends in a row, successive weekends in a row, in the hospital, when her ports or PICC lines contracted 3 different infections. Through it all, Pam characteristically smiled, determined as she was to make the best of it. I'd always thought of her as having the highest pain threshold of anyone I had ever known, but her mental toughness and optimism were inspiring to all of her doctors and nurses, and to me. With pancreatic cancer, a patient endures the discomfort of chemotherapy, the attendant exhaustion, etc., while the poison traverses the bloodstream, hopefully targeting the cancer cells along the way. After a few months of this, during which time the cells appear to be diminishing in size, and reports of their necrotic tissue encourage optimism, the drug's effectiveness begins to wane, the cancer cells recover and continue to grow, and the doctor recommends changing the prescription to a different alternative chemo drug. This scenario was replayed multiple times over the first 2 years of Pam's voyage, until our oncologist, a wonderful guy with whom I'm still very close, Dr. Richard Frank in Norwalk, finally told us that we had exhausted all of our chemo options. There wasn't another drug to try. But, he told us, he had found a new drug trial beginning in a few weeks that Pam might qualify for, and he gave us the phone number of the doctor running it in San Antonio, Texas. We called. Dr. Frank sent all the paperwork, and we were told that there was one spot left in the trial, but they needed to see Pam before she could have it. So we flew down on an August day. We got off the plane, it was 114 degrees and blowing. It was like being in a blast furnace. There was only, she was accepted. She got the last spot in the trial. And so for the next 8 months, we went to San Antonio every week. There was only one nonstop flight each way, each day. And so on Tuesday morning, we flew from JFK to San Antonio. And she was treated on Wednesday, and on Thursday morning, very early, we took the other nonstop flight back to JFK. The new drug's effectiveness looked promising, but then the scenario that I described before kicked in, and the cancer cells began to rebound. The trial ended for us, and so did our weekly sojourn after 8 months to San Antonio. During the following months back in Connecticut, she received chemotherapies that she'd had before. We continued our lives. 2 grandchildren arrived, and she was the ultimate baby whisperer, reader, and nurse. But her condition began to deteriorate. Over a period of 12 weeks, she lost a lot of weight and became dependent on pain pumps, oxygen tanks, a drain to relieve a bile duct blockage. I was her caregiver, as I had been for the previous 3.5 years, managing all of the systems, the pumps, the drains, the phenomenal list of medications that were keeping her on an even keel. Our oncologist sent over a social worker to discuss things with us. The 3 of us sat together in our bedroom, chatting amiably, while I wondered what the point of her visit was. And then she came to the point. One of her caregivers, her best one, she said, had just become available and we could have her come to us. You mean, I said, come and live here in our house and take care of Pam? Yes, she said, she's a wonderful woman. Well, then what would I do? I said. She looked surprised and she turned to Pam, who said, I think Jimmy can handle it. I don't think we want someone else in here between the 2 of us. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't know then how far down the path we were. My role had been to do whatever it took to make it possible to keep going. In retrospect, we had been dealing with extraordinary pressures, but it had become our new normal. And so a few weeks later, when Pam looked at me one morning and said, Jimmy, I don't want to wake up anymore, it took me by surprise. She saw my reaction and she said, well, we've always known this was a fatal disease. I spent the day grappling with that news, trying to figure out where I was and how I could help her. And around 11 o'clock that night, as I slipped into bed next to her, she woke up and she peered at me through the darkness, through her medicated haze, and she said, oh, I thought I wasn't going to have to wake up anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, when the person that you have loved for your whole life, with whom you fought so hard for 4 years to survive, says that to you, there is nothing that you wouldn't do. There was nothing that I wouldn't do to give her what she wanted, what she deserved, which was her release from her suffering. And so here I am, still trying to do the right thing for Pam. Last fall, we would have been married for 55 years. And in April, 6 weeks ago, incredibly for me, it's been 9 years since I lost her. And we're all going to die. Painlessly, we hope, surrounded by our loved ones in our storybook mind's eye. But there are those among us who are not so lucky, and it is for those people that this law, medical aid in dying, sometimes called the right to die with dignity, it's for those people that this law is necessary. the folks who do not go gently. I recognize that there are several groups that are interested in preventing this bill from becoming law. People with disabilities have told us that they're afraid of being coerced into ending their lives prematurely, which is, by the way, a felony. However, there's a paper trail that goes back to when Oregon passed this law. They were the first state that did in 1997, 25 years ago. And at the end of every season, at the end of every year, Oregon has it's mandated in their state law that if there is that there has to be a report as to whether or not there has ever been any coercion of a person for any reason. Some heir who decides that if he could get grandpa to take this medication, he could make some money. So there's a paper trail. It's 25 years in Oregon and all the other states. There are 9 other states plus the District of Columbia that have passed this since then. And you know what? There has been no such problem. And that should be reassuring to the people with disabilities and to all of us. Another group that's not been sympathetic to this legislation is the religious community. I certainly don't believe that I or anyone else should be able to tell them what to believe or how to live their lives or end them. Former Governor Mario Cuomo, in a speech at the University of Notre Dame in 1984, spoke eloquently about how he addressed these problems of public morality as both a governor and as a Catholic. He said that in our pluralistic society, we create our public morality through consensus. The arguments start when religious values are used to support positions which would impose on other people restrictions they find unacceptable. When should I argue to make my religious value your morality? He said. My rule of conduct your limitation. Another Catholic governor, Jerry Brown from California, a former seminarian, said in 2015, I do not know what I would do if I were dying in prolonged and excruciating pain. I am certain, however, that it would be a comfort to be able to consider the options afforded by this bill, and I wouldn't deny that right to others. One of the most appreciated aspects of this law, we're told from people who are dying, is the peace of mind that it gives them. Even if they don't exercise it, just knowing that it's there, knowing that if they need it, if the suffering becomes too much to bear, it will be available to them, releases them from spending their final weeks and months in fear. I mentioned what Mario Cuomo said and what Governor Jerry Brown said. And this is being talked about right now in the UK. There's a move afoot to try to get legislation passed there. And with the League of Women Voters in the state of Delaware right now, it's going on. And so all of these groups are talking to each other. And some of the terms that are coming out from different areas in the states and across the pond, people are saying, if you are a pro-choice person, then you are for bodily autonomy. And you should be then for the bodily autonomy of choosing how you're going to manage your own demise. I've, over the past 4 years, been really involved with this. I've been up to Hartford several times, well, a half dozen times, to talk with legislators and to testify before the Public Health Committee, where we failed 3 years ago by one vote to get it out of the Public Health Committee. This past April or March, we won, we got it out, it passed 22-9. So that's quite a huge difference in 3 years. Also in that time, we know that the Medical Society of Connecticut, doctors in Connecticut, went from against the law to neutral, which was a big deal. The Nurses Association of Connecticut has gone from against to for the law. We've seen in polling, Connecticut residents now, the latest number is that 75% of us want this to be passed. Now, there are some of us who don't really know what's going on, or that it's even a possibility, or it's something over there that they don't have to think about. But 3 out of 4 Connecticut residents wanting it is a very significant number. And that includes 69% of Catholics wanting it. So obviously, 69% of the Catholics aren't going along with their leadership on this issue. In the 4 years that I've been up and testifying, I've met some people who have passed while they are still waiting for this law to be passed. They are gone. I was telling folks here at my table that one of the ladies that I met a couple of years ago had spent her career as a hospice nurse, lives in Connecticut. She has stage 4 metastatic lung cancer, and she was begging the people on the Public Health Committee 3 years ago to please pass this law because I know I'm going to need it, and I know what's coming at me, she said. I inquired about her a couple of months ago, and they said, oh yeah, Sharon, she sold her house, and she's established residency in New Jersey because New Jersey passed this law 2 years ago. And I said, you mean to tell me that at this stage of her life and death, she has to sell her house, move away from her home, her relatives, her neighbors, her support community, her doctors, in order to go and qualify for this in one of the 10 states and the District of Columbia that allows it? And they said yes. And I thought that's pretty cruel. The states, by the way, for your information, that have passed it so far: Maine, Vermont, New Jersey, Colorado, Montana, a red state, Washington, Oregon, California, and recently New Mexico, and Hawaii, and the District of Columbia. So anyway, I'm pleased to have been able to talk about the issue, and if you have any questions, I'd love to address them. Perhaps some of you wonder, well, what is the law? How does it work? What do you have to do? What are the restrictions? How dangerous is it that it might become abused? If you'd like to talk about any of those things, I'd be happy to address them with you. Anybody have a question? Yes.
I have a personal interest in this because everybody knows me. I have stage 4 cancer, and I'm doing really well.
Good.
So I have very specific instructions. Up the morphine and do whatever you have to do. Hopefully I won't need it for a while. But I would love to get involved in this. If I could be of any help or tell us how we could be more activist about this. It's very personal to me. I'd love to get involved.
Well, there's an organization, it's actually a nationwide organization, called Compassion and Choices. Go on their website.
Okay.
There are ways in which you can be helpful, and that will tell you how to do it. I'm in touch with those people. Anybody else? Yes.
I have a question. Are you familiar with Dignitas, the organization in Switzerland?
Yes.
Okay, I just wondered.
Did you read Amy Bloom's book?
I sure did.
Yeah.
That familiarized me quite a bit.
Yeah.
With that, and I think it's just a great model. Do you think there's any prayer at all that it could be possibly in this country at some point?
Well, we're a long way from getting there. I had a dear friend, a guy that lived in Westport. I used to play squash with him at the old Y. And he moved down to Florida to be near his youngest daughter. And he had Parkinson's, and he was falling apart, and he begged his daughter to take him to Switzerland. Because what medical aid in dying bill says in all these states, it's basically all based on the same program that Oregon inaugurated in '97. You have to have 2 doctors who diagnose that you have only 6 months or less to live. Now, that Amy Bloom's husband wouldn't have qualified for that, but he wanted to go out, as he said, standing, right? And so there is a place for that, and it's in Switzerland, and I think that there's another country that may do that as well. In our country, we can't get this thing passed in all of these different states with a 6-month diagnosis or less. And in fact, after you make the request and get 2 doctors to sign off on it, you have to wait 2 weeks and then go back and ask them again to prevent the law from being used for people who are depressed to commit suicide. Those are some of the that's one of the safeguards. I have a dear friend, I had a dear friend, we were in City of Angels together, Rene Obergenois, wonderful actor. And he died 2 years ago in December after stage 4 for many years, lung cancer. And in California, it's legal, so he got it. And he said to his wife, after on a Saturday morning with his 2 dear children, their 2 children and his wife, they spent the morning listening to their favorite music, they looked at their favorite photographs, and then he took the cocktail and he said, write to our friends and tell them, I'm proud that I live in a state that recognizes a person's right to die with dignity. Yes?
So you said it came out of the committee 22-9.
Yes.
But it never came for a vote?
Well, you want to know what happened? We were thinking it was going to happen. We got it through the committee, 22-9. It's going to go to the floor. 75% of the people want it. The representatives and the senators know that. The co-chairman, the 2 co-chairmen of the Judiciary Committee spent the weekend talking about how we're going to get this thing through the Judiciary Committee, because it got sent after Public Health over to Judiciary, where last year it went to die. They didn't even bring it to a vote. But since then, there's been a lot more movement in our direction. An obscure rule was invoked that a lot of people on that committee didn't even know existed. And so what they did was they separated, it's a 40-person committee, they separated the House of Representatives vote from the Senate vote. There were 9 senators, 4 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and one of the Democrats flipped. And so we lost by 1 vote again. And if you talk about and think about bodily autonomy, you know, we throw around the word freedom an awful lot in our country, don't we? Well, this is one of those issues that I think should be. A person should have the freedom to do what he or she thinks is the right thing to do. We do it for our animals, God knows. What do? We put them out of their misery. Any other questions? Yes.
How does this, legally speaking, overlap with the do not resuscitate choices that people can make for themselves?
Well, that's a good question. We actually recognize, don't we, that a person has the right to say, do not resuscitate. By the way, don't call the EMTs if you want that to work, because it's a messed up situation, right? We do recognize it, though, on the one hand. But on the other hand, we can't get this law passed. It's a very small percentage of people who would use it. In fact, among the people in these other states who do go to the trouble of establishing residency and getting 2 doctors and doing the whole thing and having 6 months or less to live, a third of those people who go through all the trouble and dot all the I's and cross all the T's don't use it. But as I said, that we know from what they tell us that it's tremendously settling to them to be able to know that it's there if they need it. That's a good question. I'll have to talk to my friends at Compassion and Choices and say, well, is there any connection here? Could we use that argument to try to get there? Yes.
Is there any, and at the risk of being a little morbid, but is there any research or data on how many people might choose another means because it's not available for them in this dignified manner, that they take things into their own hands?
Well, people do that. We know that. In Connecticut, there are a couple of cases that have been prosecuted. One very, very ill old grandmother asked her son to please mash up these pills in her applesauce. And he was prosecuted for it. Another fellow asked his best friend, they were hunters and fishermen and anglers, and they'd been together for, ever, if he would clean his revolver for him. And so he did. His friend cleaned the revolver, and he said, just, leave it there. And the guy cleaned his friend's gun, and he walked out of the house. He asked him to leave the house. He got outside, and bam. He was prosecuted up in northwestern Connecticut. And you know why? Because that particular prosecutor chose to do it. It really is that arbitrary. And so the guy had to spend $250,000 on defense attorneys to try to keep from going to prison because he couldn't bear not to put his friend out of his misery when asked to help. Yes?
So other than the religious objection, is it basically there's a fear that it will be abused? Is that the reason to vote against it? I mean, what's the reasons other than the obvious, that it can be abused? I mean, what do they say?
Well, the people with disability, there are people with disabilities who are kind of professional testifiers. I've seen them because we've been on the same, we've been before the Public Health Committee now 2 or 3 times. They have flags, and they're in wheelchairs, and that's their job. I'm sure they believe that what they're doing is right, but as I say, they're ignoring the paper trail. The only evidence that Oregon said that they get, that the only objection that Oregon writes about from people with disabilities is not that they're going to be coerced, but some of them, people with ALS, for example, say, we can't self-administer. And the law says we have to be able to self-administer. That's the complaint that they get. So it's the flip side of it. Perhaps you've heard the term disinformation. There's an awful lot of that. I was on the radio, I did a radio interview a year ago, WELI in New Haven, and I listened to the rest of the program, and the other gentleman who was being interviewed after me was a Baptist minister from Bridgeport named Reverend Anthony Bennett. And Anthony Bennett said that he wanted this legislation to be passed. And the interviewer said, I'm surprised. I thought because you were a religious person that you were going to be against this. And he said, no. And he has a voice like James Earl Jones. And he said, no. He said, I support this because I don't think that my body is all of who I am. I have a soul. And if the body falls apart and deteriorates and dies, my soul lives on. So, there are as many different ways of looking at this as, I guess, there are people. Certainly the DNR is an interesting question. Reverend Anthony Bennett has, I guess, a personal and maybe unique way of looking at it. I don't know that it needs to be unique. It makes sense if you're a religious person. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm wondering, I don't know the organization structure of hospice, but I would think that the hospice industry would be a proponent of this.
There are a lot of people in the hospice industry who are. I went out to lunch with Jim. Was it you and I who went together with a gal? Or maybe it was Will Haskell, Senator Will Haskell and I. We had lunch with a woman who had just retired from one of the hospice agencies in Stamford, I think. She said, I think that a lot of us would love to see this. And a lot of people who do take advantage of it are people who are being treated in hospice. Because as I said, it takes away the fear. And if you need it, if you get there, it's there. And you don't know until you get there. There was a woman, I don't know if she's still there, she's the head of the Hospice Association of Connecticut, who was, I think, misrepresenting what the hospice directors believed and wanted. I think she had a religious issue, and it was a personal issue, but she was going out as the person who was the head of the hospice organization of Connecticut, telling people in Hartford and the legislature that hospice was against it. And when asked, it's a very loose bunch of hospice places. Yeah. And so there isn't a very strong organization. They don't really have much of a hierarchy. If you want to build one, I'm sure that they'd love it if you would, because it's going to take care of people. My parents were both, benefited from being in hospice or having hospice nurses come when they needed them, and they were wonderful.
One more thing.
Yeah.
Someone asked about DNR. They do have a personal awareness of a recent situation where her husband was in hospice and he had fallen in the bedroom, and that she is not strong enough to get him back into bed.
Yeah.
And the DNR, and there's the question, what are you gonna do? And she had the number of the firehouse, and she called them. It's not an emergency, I just need some muscle and some guys to help me get my head. They were there in a minute. No sirens, they just came, the firemen came and helped her. But it's a difficult line you're walking, because you do not want the medical people involved. You just want comfort for your patient and your loved one. It's very hard.
I heard a story this past week about a woman whose husband fell out of bed, and she called the fire department and the EMTs, that they came, and this guy was very, very close to the end. And she just wanted them to put him back in his bed, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They were going to take him to the hospital. She says, they said, we're taking him. She said, could we call the doctor on the fire department? And they said, okay. They called the doctor, and the doctor said, oh yeah, of course you can put him back. We'll put him back in bed. And they did. But that's where we live. You're lucky if you get the right guy, and if you don't, you're out of luck. Yes.
So the process will be, this will be brought up again in the next legislative.
It sure will.
It will go back through the public health.
It sure will.
It will go back to judiciary.
Well,
hopefully.
actually, I was talking to the chairman of the Public Health Committee, Jonathan Steinberg. He's the representative, and he's just been dedicated to this cause. And he said, we're going to do it differently next year. We're going to try to get it to go to judiciary first. Let them write the damn bill, and then maybe we can. But we're all going to be up there again.
But you need help.
We need help. And the more people there are who are writing to their Congress, to their legislators, that's what it takes. Senator Will Haskell is this wonderful young man, graduated from Georgetown, ran in the fall and was elected. So now all of a sudden he's like 4 months out of Georgetown. He looks like he's about 14 years old, and he's a state senator from Westport and Wilton and Richfield. And he's really, really a wonderful young man and smart. He's not going to run this year. He's going to go to law school, and he's going to get married to his high school sweetheart. They were chemistry partners at Staples High School in Westport. I started to tell you something about Will. I don't know why.
What the path was for next year, the path to go to judiciary.
Yeah.
Jonathan Steinberg?
Yeah, well, it was Jonathan Steinberg who said that next year they're going to try to do it differently. Instead of having to go back through public health again, where we've already passed it now twice in the last 2 years, we're going to try to do it differently. Boy, it'd be nice if they could reconfigure who's on that Judiciary Committee.
Well, we have with us, hopefully, the person that will replace Will Haskell.
Yes, Cece. Yes. Cece Mayer. Yep, there she is. But if you want to get involved, any of you, or if you have friends and you say, let's do something about this, let's do something, go to Compassion and Choices. What I started to say about Will Haskell was, Will told me, if his office gets 4 phone calls on any particular issue, that rings a bell in their office. That's a lot. So it doesn't take an awful lot to get the attention of some of these legislators. And when I'm on the radio talking to these people, saying, I'm out there saying, call, write, email. It does make a difference. I mean, that's what we are, right? A representative so-called democracy, so-called, we used to be. Anyway, that's what it takes, and it's worth doing. And I'm sure that the folks at Compassion and Choices would be really happy to sign you up. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your testimony about your life and how you worked with this bill. I have not read the bill. I do know that in this country, you know, we're not a democracy. Women are not equal under the Constitution, based on this leaked Alito opinion. The work that Justice Ginsburg has done on intermediate scrutiny for sex discrimination has been knocked down to a rational basis. Women are, can be discriminated against by the government in this country at will, at whim. And so the question I have is, how do you prevent the government going forward from discriminating against women, and to the extent that they are impoverished because they do not have equal pay, and they're the servant class and the slave class, and they're not paid for their care economy and their care labor. How do you prevent the government from discriminating at the end of life?
That's an awful lot packed into that question. But I guess the one answer that I have, if it is much of an answer, we live in a country where only 50% of us vote. That's pretty poor. I mean, that's the poorest of all the Western democracies, so-called. I don't know what it's going to take to build a fire under people on a lot of social and cultural issues. But that's what it's going to take. So if each one of us here said, okay, I'm going to go out and talk to 10 friends, and I'm going to try to get them to do something about any of the things that you just mentioned. I guess that's called networking, right?
But
Well,
I guess it's in the bills, like how do you protect women from the government discriminating against women? I guess the question is are these statistics done by sex? How many men have chosen to do this right to die, and how many women have chosen it?
I don't know the answer to that. I think anecdotally we think of the old guy is going to go before the old lady, right? So there are a lot of widows. I think it's something for us all to think about and to act on, because we're not acting on it. You know, I've become an activist in my 70s. I wasn't my whole life, I don't think. I was political, I voted, I did stuff like that, but all of a sudden I find myself up here talking about these kinds of things. A couple of years ago, remember when the kids in cages was an issue down in Texas? I came home and I was listening to NPR on the radio in the car, and one of the newsmen talked about having interviewed an 8-year-old boy in one of those cages in Texas. And he said to the kid, "What's the highlight of your day?" And this child thought for a minute and he said, "I guess the highlight of my day is when they let us stand out in the hall." And I couldn't go to sleep that night. That's where we are. So I got up at about 10:30, 11 o'clock, and I wrote a little email, and I sent it off to 4 or 5 people, Senator Blumenthal among them. And a thoughtful guy, Ken Bernard, up in former legislator from Westport, and 2 other people. And 6:30 the next morning, what I said in the email was, we got to do something about this. 6:30 in the morning, Dick Blumenthal got back to me. He says, Jim, you're absolutely right. This is worse than you even know. I've been there. And Ken Bernard, who's a really thoughtful guy, wrote me a 4 or 5 paragraph answer. And then at the end of it, he said, you want to go down on the bridge, and maybe the two of us should go down on the bridge and march. You know, the Westport Bridge where all the... So I called him up and I said, you want to do that? Should we do a march? He said, yeah. How about like a week from Friday? No, it's got to be this weekend. It was Wednesday. He goes, it's Wednesday, Jim. I said, yeah, I know, but we're going away next week. We got to do it now. I said, I'll call Dan Woog, 06880, the blog. He knows, since we don't have town newspapers anymore, we have blogs, and Dan Woog does a wonderful job in Westport. He said, okay, I'll call the chief of police and the first selectman, Jim Marpy, and tell him and ask him if there's any problem. I said, okay, I'll call you back in 15 minutes. And I did. He said, okay, we're on. All right, this Saturday. So I went out and borrowed a friend's PA system, a musician named Chris Coogan, who went to high school with my son, and they had a garage band together. And we set it up in Jessup Green in Westport. And Dan Woog, I wrote an article. He said, well, I can't just promote something, but I could report it. I said, okay. He said, write the article and I'll put it. Okay. And I said, I called Dick Blumenthal back. He said, what time? I said, 10 o'clock Saturday. He says, I'll be there. 10 o'clock Saturday morning. All of a sudden, we got a couple of hundred people on the bridge. Signs. I haven't made a sign since I was in high school, right? But we're up there, and somebody brought a little a bullhorn. So now we're organizing the crowd, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, to his great credit, Dick Blumenthal is walking down the bridge, and it's a hot day, and he's walking down the bridge in his shirt sleeves. He stayed for an hour. At 10:30, we went around the corner. My daughter-in-law is a singer on the Broadway stage named Kelly O'Hara, and she was about to get on the train and go do 2 shows, a matinee and an evening show of The King and I. And I said, what are you doing before you get on the 11 o'clock train? I said, at 10:30, can you sing the Star Spangled Banner? She said, okay. And she did. I went to the Westport Playhouse and I got a couple of little things, a little tiny stage, like a soapbox. We're literally on a soapbox. And I introduced Ken Bernard, and he spoke, and I told people why we were there. And Senator Blumenthal spoke. And it was just, and I came away and went, I've never done anything like this before in my whole life. I've become an activist in my 70s. But it came out of some kind of visceral feeling. And I guess that's what it takes. And if you have that, don't go to sleep on it. I sent it off to a Republican congressman I know, that same thing, and he said, well, I can't even tell you what he said, but it was ridiculous. But I thought maybe he might be interested, and he might have some interest in it, and he might, as a humanitarian, sign on to trying to do something about it. So anybody have anything else they'd like to talk about?
Just one quick question. What you said about the disability community in Oregon, and this lady's comments about women, made me wonder, might there be provisions in the bill that provide for like equity of access? Because I'm wondering if this is an expensive process, like you have to go to 2 doctors and then wait 2 weeks and then go back. Like, can anybody, if we get this through, is it going to be accessible to people so that when everybody needs it, everybody can use it?
I don't think that this thing would be discriminated against, that one group, certainly no one gender over another would be discriminated against. I don't think it's meant to be expensive, and I think the group Compassion and Choices could answer that question and maybe help pay for it if someone needs the help. In a group this size, we could certainly pay a couple of doctor bills. And the doctors who would sign on to do it are not doing this for the money. They're doing it because they believe in it. So I don't think that that's an issue. And I'm sure it wouldn't have to be. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing with us what sounds like an extremely personal and difficult journey. And I just want to commend you on taking that and making it something that you share with perfect strangers for the benefit of other people you've never met, probably will never meet. So thank you for doing that. As I'm sort of listening to everything, I'm thinking about sort of what seems to be, what are the common areas and issues, and one of them seems to be engagement. So you have a lot of approval, you know, most people are okay with this, but it's hard to kind of get it over the hump politically. Some of that, I think, not to be solved, but I think part of the problem is maybe how we relate to death and dying and the end of your life. And the message I want to give is, if you need more people to sort of make this a present issue in their lives, you also have to invite people into that discussion. And that can be a hard thing because it is sort of like a dark topic and people like to push away things that they're afraid of. But on the engagement piece, and in terms of getting more people to think about this, yes, like probably go reach out to your network and say, call your congressperson or state senator. But also, I think culturally, mentally, part of it is accepting that part of life is the end. And if you want younger people to sort of take ownership, politically speaking, of this issue, then there also need to be shown that there is an issue. And a lot of people don't like thinking about, you know, their 20-year-olds, their 19-year-olds, 15-year-olds thinking about death and dying. But I think if we can sort of maybe have a bit of a cultural shift around how we think about this stuff, then you might see increased engagement. So maybe trust the younger people in your lives to handle this stuff and show them and lead how that part of it is the end, and we can sort of do something courageous with it too. So that's my.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful and useful, I think. You know, we have a saying in this community, on this issue, that a person who's against this law is only one bad death in his family from coming on board. There's a representative, I think he's not a senator, but a legislator, a Connecticut legislator, who was against this 2 years ago. And then his father had a very, very bad death, and now he's on board. It's just too bad that we have to rely on those kinds of experiences in order to address the issue. And a lot of it is, yeah, it's not a lot of fun to talk about people dying all the time. We kind of all don't want to go there. But I've been there, and it made a lasting impression on me, obviously. And so here I am, and I thank you for the invitation to come and talk about it and discuss it. Talk among yourselves and go out and get 10 people to write to your congressman. Find out which ones are against it. There aren't a lot, but there are enough, and they need to be addressed. And Google compassion and choice and choices.org, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.